come on. I ain't gonna bite you. Come around here and let me have a look at you. My goodness, look at you. You turned out all right, didn't you? How do you feel?
I
know you're not sleeping. We'll get to that. Why don't you come and have a sit this time?
Maybe I'll stand.
Well, suit yourself.
I felt like sitting.
I know. So, let's get the obvious stuff out of the way.
You're not human, are you?
Well, it's tough to get any more obvious than that.
If I had to guess, I'd say you're a program from the machine world. So is he.
So far, so good.
But if that's true, that could mean you are part of this system. Another kind of control.
Keep going.
I suppose the most obvious question is, how can I trust you?
Bingo. It is a pickle, no doubt about it. Bad news is there's no way if you can really know whether I'm here to help you or not. So it's really up to you. Just have to make up your own damn mind to either accept what I'm going to tell you or reject it. Candy?
Do you already know if I'm going to take it?
Wouldn't be much of an oracle if I didn't.
But if you already know, how can I make a choice?
Because you didn't come here to make the choice. You've already made it. You're here to try to understand why you made it. I thought you'd have figured that out by now.
Why are you here?
Same reason. I love candy.
But why help us?
We're all here to do what we're all here to do. I'm interested in one thing, Neo, the future. And believe me, I know the only way to get there is together.
Good evening, YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning into this groundbreaking story. I'm going to dedicate this log to my mother because I have the courage and the strength and the opportunity to call out something that was done to my mother and my aunts that my mother never had the chance to do. This is a very difficult video for me, but I'm being empowered because I feel like it needs to be told. The two people that this involved are deceased. And as I mentioned in my introduction video, and I think I mentioned it in another video, but my mother passed away, and she suffered from mental illness for the majority of my life. My grandfather passed away before my mother did, and there were a lot of things that I went through before my grandfather died and after, and there were a lot of things that I went through in my life with my mother. A lot of things that happened in the cult, especially when my mother really lost it. And what I mean by that is that my mother always had emotional issues, but she was very functional. She really went off the deep end when she married my stepfather, and she started having different types of illness. And she had a hysterectomy, and that just really pushed her over the edge. And the next thing I know, my mom has run down the street in her nightgown and has been picked up by the police and is put in a psych ward. So that's a separate video that I want to talk about mental illness and the Jehovah's Witness cult. But that happening to me when I was younger, because that happened to me when I was 15, 16, and that's another reason that I lived with my grandparents when I was 16. Excuse me. And when I went on my own and I got disfellowshipped and basically had enough money to create my own life, and finally got into college and stayed in the college and really excelled. But as I mentioned in my previous video, I don't want to project that it was this straight road, that I had everything figured out, that I didn't have times when I was angry. There weren't times when I wasn't. There were times when I was angry. There were times when I was upset. There were times when I was isolated. There were times when, even when I had my friends, that I would just shut down and want to be by myself and feel sad and confused and, you know, trying to figure it out. How was I going to create a life different from what I had been raised? Because this had been my life for 17, years. So it wasn't this straight road, but I had a lot of people that really looked out for me. And even when because I also mentioned that I'm involved in a lot of organizations and I do a lot of mentoring with young people. And one of the things that I always tell them is that if it wasn't for people that mentored me, I would not be where I am today. There were people that saw something in me and helped me to get my head on straight and helped me to stay focused and helped me to excel. Because even though I had money, I was in college, there was still a part of me that missed all of the closeness that I had when I was in the JW cult. I didn't have that same, fuel. But I found people that looked out for me, and I found people that were there for me. And it really, really helped me to keep moving and to get balance and to move forward in my life. So I started to study human behavior along with journalism. And as I started studying it, I studied philosophy, I studied sociology, I studied psychology. And like I said, I have quite a few degrees, and just getting my undergrad, I really started learning about mental illness and learning about the different types of issues that people have. And I never forget, I was in a class, and it was an upper level class, and it was talking about the signs of sexual abuse. And by that time, my mother had been put on medication, had been diagnosed, misdiagnosed, had different diagnoses and things that they said, but had been in and out of the hospital, had been in and out of, a lot of different places. So we were trying to figure out, and this is when I would talk to my family, my grandparents, because everyone was really worried about my mother. And I would go visit my mom and I would talk to her. And, again, just because you're disfellowship and you're shunned, when things like that happen, they need you. And I would go because it was my mom, And again, I'm not saying that my story is typical, but this is my, the story that I experienced. And I would notice the things that she would say. One time, my mother tried to commit suicide, and I rushed. I had to go quite a few states to be there. And I asked my mother why she had tried to commit suicide. And she said that my grandfather, by this time he was dead, had come to her in her dreams, and she was scared. So I remembered something that had happened to me previously when I had been in class and we're talking about symptoms of sexual abuse. And I remember when something first hit me about the things that were going on with my mother, because we were always trying to figure out how this happened. There's a lot of people walking around today that have some of the emotional issues that my mom had when I was younger. I work with people all the time that I feel like you could use a little therapy, but they're functional, they're fine. I mean, that's pretty much how my mom was. She had bouts of emotionalism, and a lot of it had to do with being in the Kingdom Hall. My mom was always having meetings with the brothers for one thing or another. And my stepfather, they had this back and forth with the congregation that they were in. And I just honestly, as an aside, I just have a problem with this whole tattletale, always trying to catch somebody in something, always trying to meet with somebody. That makes people a certain way, because you walk around feeling like someone is always watching you, or you're always having to talk to people about your behavior. Every little thing you do, someone is, trying to meet with you. As a boss, I am very cognizant of the fact that I don't always want to have meetings with my staff about every little thing. I'm not a micromanager, and you're not going to get your best work from people that are always walking around feeling like they have to be on eggshells because they feel like they're under a microscope and their job is in jeopardy. And with a congregation and with the Kingdom Hall, it's like you could lose your entire family, your entire support system if someone thinks that you've done something. So you're always, it makes you sort of jumpy and people that have issues anyway, it just doesn't help. So my mom and my stepfather were always dealing with things. And being in that cult did not help. In fact, I think a lot of it had to do with that. So when I started talking to my mother, after I started taking some upper level courses on human behavior and sexual abuse, a light bulb went off inside of me. And I was like, my mom, her mental illness and the themes that I pick up on are so familiar to and similar to what would be the signs of someone that has been sexually abused. By this time, there had been a lot of stories about my mom from the time she was young, and things that my grandmother would say, but my grandmother was never one to say things straight out. You kind of had to piece them together. So I came up with a theory. I never shared it with anyone because I wanted to be wrong. But I started thinking about my grandfather, and I started thinking about the things I had seen even growing up that were signs that my grandfather was a sexual predator. There were things that my grandfather did, like he never closed the door when he went to the bathroom. He always left it open. And it got to the point where we knew never to come up the steps if we heard that little tinkle sound, because it was my grandfather going in the bathroom. And this was like something that he would do almost like he wanted you to catch him doing it. And there were other things that he did that made me uncomfortable, and I could never truly articulate it. But all of a sudden, I started to have this theory. And this was hard for me because on the one part, my grandfather has always been wonderful to me. He loved me. He gave me whatever I wanted. He, you know, even with all the things happening in Kingdom Hall, my grandfather, even though, you know, at one point they confronted me when I was living with them. I mean, even after I got this fellowship, even more than my grandmother, which is really interesting. You know, my grandfather was always like, you always have a home with us. You can always come, blah, blah, blah. So on one point, my grandfather was this loving, decent man. But so it was really difficult for me to even let my mind consider it. But there were so many signs. The more educated I was, the more that I had to ask the hard questions. No one had ever said anything to me. They never confirmed anything for me until after my grandfather died. So my grandfather was a presiding overseer in his congregation until he was considered too old. And when he died, 400 people came to my grandfather's funeral. It was an interesting event. A lot of things happened with my aunt, the JW sympathizer. Karma is a very interesting thing, because at one point she was crying. They wouldn't let her come to the repast. She had to do a separate one. The JWs were really trying to push my aunt out of my grandparents' house. The thing is that my grandfather had made her the executor, but because she was disfellowship and she was not part of the cult, these JWs had the audacity to try and tell her she had to leave the house, because it was only going to be JWs in there. So, I mean, yeah, they can be very bold, and they can be very, very arrogant and full of themselves. So my grandfather dies. We bury him. I still had this thing that I had in my head that I thought. And then about 3 weeks after my grandfather died, my mom tried to commit suicide. And this was what she told me as the reason why she had tried to commit suicide. So they kept her in an institution. Well, they call it a psychiatric hold for 30 days. They extended it to 60 days. They put her on some medication and they discharged her. And she was living. About 2 months after that, my aunt and my cousin come for a visit. I never forget this visit. It was on a Sunday. And it was out of the blue, because they had to come a few states to come visit me. And I never forget it. We're sitting there, and all of a sudden, you know, it's like, good to see you, you know, glad my mom, you know, my aunt, I should have come and visited you so many times. I'm so sorry I keep putting it off, and, you know, I'm so glad that we had this time to come down and see you. But, you know, there was like a white elephant in the room. Like, you know that there's something that they want to tell you, but you don't know how to get into it, so you're kind of like circling, you know, talking about everything, talking about the weather, talking about the kids, the grandkids, and then finally it starts. I can't go into one family secret because it doesn't have anything to do with this story, but there was something that they told me about my grandfather that was shocking. but I think it would identify him like right away if I said this, and that's really not the point. It wasn't about sexual abuse. So we start talking some more. We start talking about my mom and talking about, my mom trying to commit suicide, and so I said, I've had theories about my mom's mental health. By that time I had, had conversations with my mother's therapist, and it's only so much I can tell you, but because I was her only daughter and was really concerned, they were able to tell me some things, and so I was just kind of communicating with my aunt. I said, I have a theory about my mom, just because my aunt started talking about things that she had never mentioned before about my mother when she was growing up. So they had been born Jehovah's Witnesses. So she was talking about some stories about my mom, and I said, well, I always felt that there was someone close to her, someone in the family that sexually abused my mother, because her whole psychiatric breaks, her whole issues, they all seem to come from somewhere where I have to believe there was sexual abuse. So, and my cousin looked at me and she said, do you have any idea who it is? And I said, I have an idea, but I'd rather not say. And I don't know why I said that. My grandfather was such a revered man that it was difficult for me to say my grandfather, like grandpa. So my cousin looked at me and she said, it was grandpa. I was like, what? She's like, it was grandpa. And I looked at my aunt. And she was like, it was grandpa. I'm like, grandpa? 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 She's like, yeah. He sexually abused me. He sexually abused your mom. He used to do all kind of stuff to me growing up. She's like, he used to abuse me so bad that I used to didn't think he was my father. And this was hard for me because my aunt, when I was growing up, and I'm talking about until they died, my aunt was the #1 person going over to their house, even though she was disfellowship taking care of them. So I'm like, what? Grandpa raped you? He repeatedly raped you when you were growing up? She's like, yeah, all the kids got out of the house when they were 18. You should have seen my face. You should have seen how I wanted to throw up. Like, because I started to remember something that had happened to me, and it was just too much. When life just becomes too real that you don't know how you're going to deal with that next second. Do you know what that's like? Because my whole world had been turned upside down in a second. And I said, did Grandma know? And she was like, Grandma knew. But she could never do anything because of the 2-witness rule. So we confronted him. We confronted Grandma. And she would put her head down and she would say, I can't do anything. The Jehovah's Witness rule, we can't There's nobody else. I'm like, y'all could have all got together. She was like, no, they wouldn't have believed me. They wouldn't have believed me. And I was like, what? 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 But it gets worse. 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 There was a family member, my mother's cousin, that my grandmother used to talk about. She used to talk about my grandfather's niece. And there was this story, if you know African American stories and how people talk from the South, there's always some story about back in the day, or some, something that they want to talk to you about while they're cooking. So I was a kid when my grandmother started talking about my grandfather's niece, because, well, let me just tell you how it came up. My grandmother I used to pop beans with my grandmother. I would help her prepare food for Sunday dinner or Saturday dinner. And it was this really great tradition that me and my grandmother had. So she would give me a bowl to pop, and she would pop another bowl at the sink, and I would pop a bowl at the table. So we're popping beans. And she says, I don't know if I should tell you this story, but I'm going to tell you. She said, you know the story about your grandfather's niece, your mom's cousin? I said, no. She's like, well, she had both. I'm like, what do you mean she had both? She's like, let me tell you something. I was standing right here at the sink because my grandfather's niece had lived with my grandmother and my grandfather for 2 years. She was my grandfather's sister's daughter. And she lived with them for about 2 or 3 years. And during that time, she would be with my grandmother, sometimes cooking and stuff like that. So my grandmother told me that one day she came to her and said, I have something to tell you. And my grandmother said, what is it? And she said, I have both. And my grandmother said, what are you talking about? And she said, I have a penis and a vagina. She's like, what? And, I can tell my grandmother's voice. She's like, I was holding on the side of the sink. I thought I was going to faint. And she said, do you want to see it? And my grandmother was like, no, baby, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. So there was a story that went around, that my grandfather had a niece that was a hermaphrodite. So it was always like, did you hear this story about, I'm not going to say the person's name, but blah, blah, blah. So then, as my aunt and my cousin are telling stories, they bring this person up. And, as I'm like, still reeling, like literally I'm almost like doubled over because I'm so sick to my stomach. And it seemed like they were on a roll. I don't think they were enjoying it. I think that was just what they had decided to do, was to get all these secrets out. And so, as I'm saying, Grandpop's a pedophile. And my aunt was like, Grandpop's whole family comes from a family of incest. And in the same breath, she asked me if I remember the story of my grandfather's niece. And I said, the hermaphrodite? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, I know that's Grandpop's niece, my mom's cousin. She's like, that's not my cousin. that's my sister. I was like, what are you talking about, Willis? She's like, your grandfather had a child with his sister. I can take a lot. I'm a very tough person. I can handle a lot. But after that, I literally had enough. And I said, I literally don't want to hear anything else that you guys may have intended to tell me. Emotionally, it was a little too much to deal with in one sitting. My whole entire feeling of this cult, of my grandfather, of everything that had happened, just went through the roof. In contempt, would not even begin to address it. My grandfather was a presiding overseer. He was someone who people still talk about and revere. And my grandfather slept with his daughters, slept with his sister, and actually had a child. And he was never brought to justice. He was never brought to justice. And when I hear the stories of the people that have dealt with the same thing, how dare that cult come back at us? I have no reason to lie. I have no reason to make any of this up. There are too many people that have suffered. My mother's dead. And a lot of the reason that my mother died way before her time was because of all the things she suffered at the hands of men in that cult that never were brought to justice. After all the things my father did, beat her, cheated on her, married his mistress, and a lot of things that he did just in general. He's been disfellowshipped 4 times. He literally almost broke up multiple families because he had affairs with witness women while he was disfellowshipped. And you mean to tell me that even after all of that time, all he has to do is get 100 hours in field service for 6 months and you make him a ministerial servant and then an elder? I mean, really, how can you say that you have a clean organization when you have these people that are dealing with all of the issues that come from being abused? And you tell your members not to be a part of the world, so they keep going to unqualified, uneducated elders that are using doctrine to treat people that have multiple issues. My siblings have suffered so much. There's things I can't even talk about that they went through. They've been emotional cripples. And now I understand it. It makes a lot of sense because now I understand what was the basis of my mom's emotionalism and her crisis. So, yeah, I have a busy life. I do a lot. But I needed to make this video, and I'm dedicating it to my mother's memory. Because one day, this cult is going to pay. They've started to pay, but I want them to understand that they cannot allow sexual predators to be a part of their organization and have access to children. And they need to take it seriously. The 2-witness rule is a mistake. All these policies that they're putting in place by people that are not trained in human behavior, that have no real experience or education dealing with sexual abuse? Why don't you have a social service component for your organization, for your people? You don't want them to be a part of the world. Well, then get something under the umbrella of your organization. Catholics have social services. Jewish people have social services. Muslim people have social services for their community. If you want them to just focus on their religion, if you want them to just focus on your belief system, why not offer them something in the umbrella of it? Too many people have suffered in silence. My mother never got her justice. Never. They take the power away from women, and it's not right. So I made this video. It wasn't easy. I don't like putting my family's business out like this, but it needed to be said. I felt like if one person that is suffering from abuse, that has suffered from abuse, needs someone to tell them that you have done nothing wrong, that you are not a bad person, that you do not have to be a victim. You do not have to have people victimize you. You can be empowered. There are people out there that care. And you are not alone. And we will continue this fight. We will continue to advocate for helpless, defenseless children and adults that feel like they have nowhere to go. I thank you for listening to me tonight. I forced myself to do this because it's been on my mind. I will take a break for about 2 weeks because this was very difficult, but also because I actually have a very busy life. But this was worth it. If I had to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, I needed to get this out. And I think I have needed to get this out for a long time. I thank everyone that is a part of the movement. And I believe that we can continue to challenge this cult, challenge this group, and tell them that if they're going to continue to be in existence, that they're going to have to address these things. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.